Welcome to RiskIQ Radio.
Welcome into RiskIQ Radio. My name is Jack Russo, and as I've said in other podcasts, I've been lucky enough to have made my way to the computer industry through the law profession. Actually, I made my way to the computer industry through high school and eventually college and mainframe computers, and law was an afterthought. So, it's like this funny history because people say, how'd you get a master's degree in computer science and work as a computer software programmer? And then I had my own little company, and then you ended up moving from Brooklyn, New York to the West Coast. Like, how did that happen? And it's a funny story. I won't retell it here, but I ended up in law school at UCLA, and that kindled my interest in focusing my law studies on the future of law and computers. And software was just then becoming something of great interest of what's the way to legally protect computer software.
Another good opportunity
It's
and
a
circumstance.
Great opportunity. The doors were opening, and then I lucked out joining a firm that now is a big firm, but we were the firm that started Apple Computer.
It's crazy.
Davis, Stafford, Kelman, and Fenwick. I say this all the time. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak walked in with no money, literally saying, we need help starting a company. What's the name? We need to reserve the corporate name. We just want the name Apple. And the corporate partner, bow ties, suspenders, and all, said, you can't just have Apple. You have to have like a formal name. How about a 3-letter acronym like ACS? And of course, Steve Jobs just about blew a circuit saying, that's crazy. We want a really friendly company. Eventually, he changed the name from Apple Computer Inc. back to just Apple. I mean, he died soon thereafter, but he actually had to hold a shareholder meeting to get that resolution. But
Wow.
The company got started in the offices of what is now Fenwick & West. Bill Fenwick was one of the key people in Steve Jobs' life and a personal attorney, still alive, still a good friend now, somewhat retired and emeritus, but that's a great law firm. That's where I started my life in law in Silicon Valley, eventually starting my own firm that's now called Computer Law. So you have kind of the 5-minute background around me. But you made your way in sort of the interesting way that you've described, where you were learning a lot of this stuff sort of on your own time.
Right.
And then eventually you became an entrepreneur and started your own company.
That's correct.
So tell us about that, because that entrepreneurial journey is always very rich and always very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, even in high school, trying to start businesses was something that I was interested in. So a web designing company, car detailing.
Okay.
I saw opportunity to kind of run my own schedule.
Okay.
And to hustle a little bit to
Okay.
get a little bit of extra money. But as I started to progress throughout my career and, I graduated college and really entered the workforce.
Yes.
I started to learn more about development.
Yes.
And to me, development was one of the most interesting things to learn. I mean, as a fellow programmer, I'm sure
Yes.
you can kind of relate to the fact that when you understand how to write code, you can effectively take ideas and make them a reality.
Yes.
And where most people think about their ideas and they spend time dreaming and wishing that they could do it, if they don't know how to code, they can't. And so they just remain ideas.
Right.
And so the beauty of what I was doing is every time I went to a job, I would get a little bit of time allocated to continue learning programming, and I would try to find ways to write code that would help me solve my job, to help me automate pieces, then I could learn more coding on the work time.
Yes.
And one of the first projects that I had was we were doing research on PDF files.
Yes.
So portable document format.
Yes, exactly. So you're getting the 3-letter,
Yeah. So at the time, that was a big way in which malware and companies and individuals were being exploited, and malware was making its way into people's computers.
Yes.
And it was mostly from a targeted standpoint. And so what that meant was governments were identifying exploits within the Acrobat PDF format and effectively weaponizing them and then sending them to individuals in order to compromise their machine and gain access into that business.
Right.
And that to me was just so fascinating to understand that a government could go after an individual in cyberspace, and that they were coming up with these ways of effectively walking through the front door and stealing information.
Yes.
And one of the first projects that I had was a tool called PDF X-ray.
Okay.
And what it would do is it would essentially look at the file format, decompile it, identify the interesting bits, and then serve it within a web interface that an analyst could use to investigate this file. And it was at a time when most tools that were being written were what we call FAT clients. They existed on the desktop.
Right.
You had to load them. They weren't part of the web.
Yes.
And to me, because I had started a web designing business, I thought the future was the web.
Yes.
This notion that like I could have an account on a server somewhere, and I could go not only from my computer, but I could go from my home computer and access the same session as if I was picking off work
Right.
from one place to the next.
Right.
And I wrote that tool, and it gained a lot of popularity, and there was a lot of social elements that got introduced to it. And I was later approached by several companies to buy that. They wanted to buy
the X-ray, the PDF X-ray.
Yeah, they
product?
wanted to buy the tool. They wanted me to go commercial, and at the time I was really afraid, and so I gave it away.
Really?
Yeah, and later as I progressed through my career, I kind of looked back at that moment and I said, "Wow, I should have really spent
Been
the
a little
time."
more business savvy.
Right, I should have learned. I was afraid to do it. I had this like imposter syndrome that I didn't know what I was doing, and so
Okay.
no one would take me seriously. But that gave me the confidence
Yes.
that when I went to my next job,
Yes.
and I was exposed to more technology, and again, sitting in the world of espionage, looking
Yes.
at governments attacking other governments attacking people, I saw a lot of opportunity to create these tools.
Yes.
And working at the company that I did, I later recognized that an idea I had felt so good that I needed to quit.
Okay. You needed to quit the company.
I needed to quit the
with.
company because it's a time where, and it still exists today, that employee agreements basically are all encompassing, and if you have a thought that pertains to this industry, that company can reserve the right to essentially claim it as theirs.
And then potentially freeze it or squash
Correct.
it, right?
So I had a number of cases where ideas were squashed by the company
Yes.
because they were risk adverse.
Yes.
When I had plenty of people telling me they would pay me the money.
Right.
And so to me, I thought this was crazy. I can look back at this now and I understand where the company was coming
Right.
from. They obviously made the right choice.
Yes.
But being a young, naive kid, I was
Right.
like, this is ridiculous.
Right.
There's money on the table. And so I ended up quitting and just ruminating on the ideas of what I could solve.
Yes.
And that's how the company PassiveTotal came to be. It was at the time, in order to do an investigation, you had to go to a number of different data sources
Right.
in order to identify, in order to try and tell the story of what was happening.
Right.
So if somebody was attacking me, I would have to extract information out of that attack and then go query 10, 15 different web repositories to get data so that I could then, as an analyst, try to figure out what was going on.
Right.
Who's attacking me? Why are they doing it? How are they doing it? Is there anything related?
Right.
And I saw an opportunity that rather than go to 15 places, I could go to one.
Yes.
And so PassiveTotal became a broker where we just brokered the connection between all these different data
So you were an
repositories.
aggregator.
We were an aggregator.
And how did you come up with the name PassiveTotal? Often said to be PT now, but what does that mean, PassiveTotal? You're getting all the total information passively. I've always wondered about this.
This is a much better explanation than that.
I'm coming up with an explanation for the name, but I've never been able to understand that name.
So what's funny is the name itself is a lesson that I learned because of PassiveTotal in short-sightedness.
Okay.
And the name came from the fact that we were predominantly aggregating data sources, passive DNS data sources.
Okay.
So passive DNS, domain name system,
Yes.
was essentially DNS data that had been saved
Yes.
that we could use to help aid an investigation and look at infrastructure.
So like archival
right.
versions.
That's right. So there was a number of different sources, and that was our exclusive start.
Okay.
There were so many passive DNS sources that we thought it was worthwhile to aggregate them into one place and provide the analyst a bunch of tools
Yes.
and functionality so that they didn't have to leave the system,
Okay.
that we could help make their job easier.
And that's the total part?
That's the total part.
So like the
all
sum
of
total?
the source, all of the passive DNS sources,
Okay.
totally covered.
Okay. And does that turn out to be thousands or hundreds or
No.
15 or like
It
what's
was
the-
under 15, I believe.
Okay.
And so at the time when we started the business, I had gotten more business savvy, so I knew to register a legal entity,
Yes.
and I kept the intellectual property
Yes.
chain clean.
Good.
We worked with lawyers. We drafted things. We did things properly.
Okay.
And so we treated it like a business.
It was a business.
It was a business. And so I got
But
scared.
you weren't charging for it, right?
No,
Were
we
you
weren't. So we started for
Yeah,
free.
yeah. You started for free, which a lot of people would say that's great if you have a lot of venture capital. But my recollection is you guys didn't raise venture capital, right?
We bootstrapped. And
Right.
so for us, it's not like we had some windfall that we could just support ourselves
Right.
indefinitely. But I quit my job because I knew that was a good way to keep the intellectual property chain clean.
Yes.
And I said, well, I'll work on this for a month, and if there's an idea that comes out of it, great.
Okay.
And so I created the idea, and we got it out there in a free state. And I said, if people use it, that'll be awesome. That's enough.
Right.
That's enough for me to be satisfied. And then I got scared, and I went and joined another company. So I stayed off for a month, and then I got scared, like, man, I should really have a job. Like, this is silly to think that I could pursue this thing. So
Okay.
I went and joined a company, and I declared it, didn't do much.
Declared it as your pre-existing invention.
Correct.
Separate from the company.
Correct.
But you
And-
were still like leaving it out there and seeing what
Right.
happened with it, right?
Yeah, I still continued to follow it. I
Okay.
saw that it was gaining more traction,
Okay.
more people using it. And it eventually got to a point where later that year, I quit that job.
Okay.
And, people started telling me, man, you should really charge for this. Like,
Okay.
we'd pay you money.
Okay.
And so it was just like PDF X-ray, only now I had a legal business. And I had a
okay.
means of, like, saying, you know what, I think you're right.
Okay.
And so
For upgraded versions, or what were they expecting you to pay for? Services? Or
so this is kind of the in the entrepreneurial world.
Yes.
You want to be careful with soliciting feedback from friends.
Yes.
The people that were telling me that they would buy this,
Yes.
I now have later learned that they didn't necessarily carry the juice, as we would say. They weren't
Okay.
the economic buyer.
Oh, the economic buyer.
So they were saying, charge for it, we'll pay
Yes.
for it. But they
Okay.
had no means to pay for it. And
Okay.
they had no intention to. And it was
Okay.
just, they were excited that someone else was doing this, and they
Yes.
knew them.
Okay.
And so, again, I got scared. I
Okay.
said, okay, well, I'll develop the services. But I was a big proponent of working nights and weekends.
Okay.
And I thought to myself, well, I got a job at Facebook.
Okay.
And I said, well, you know what? I'll declare it again.
Yes.
They had no problem with me working on it.
Yes.
And I worked nights and weekends. And I got it to a state where later that year in April,
Okay.
April or May, it might have been June. It was June. In June, we had enterprise services ready to go. And, we launched those services. And within the first month, we had a customer pay us, the full premium. And at that point, my partner, who
also worked for Facebook, or
no, he was working at one of the previous jobs.
Okay.
Him and I kind of talked as I wrote the code. It was fun to share stories from the old days.
Right.
And he eventually quit his job once we had that money, because at that point, being a bootstrapped business, the benefit is that first inbound customer paid all of our lawyer fees, and we were net positive.
Nice.
And we had a pipeline that, because it was freemium, and we spent a year onboarding hundreds of people, and we had the forward thinking to collect information about them, who they
Nice.
were, where they worked.
Nice.
We had a pipeline that we could go after.
Now, were you on the East Coast still, or you come to California for Facebook?
I moved to the West Coast for Facebook,
Okay.
and my partner was in Memphis, Tennessee.
Okay.
And so him and I worked together through Slack. We would meet each other, and
And that's worked for you, right? This
yeah.
whole virtual way of working has
Yeah.
worked.
I mean, it certainly, there's a story unto itself
Yes.
where it did not work.
Okay.
But I've learned how to make that work, and it's I wouldn't replace it. I very much enjoy it.
Okay.
But yeah, we shortly after we had we had 2 customers sign, and we had talks with RiskIQ. Specifically, spoke with Lou, the CEO, at Black Hat.
Yes.
And one of the guys on the research team, his name was James Pleger.
Yes.
No longer with the business,
Yes.
but still in the industry doing work.
Yes.
He was encouraging Lou, like, hey, we should really check these guys out.
Right.
They just launched enterprise services.
Yes.
This is exactly what we need. You should consider buying them.
Yes.
They're going to be pretty cheap.
Yes.
And, fast forward to a whole bunch of nerve-wracking meetings amongst each other.
Right.
Obviously exciting, but very much scary and unknown. All the while having a job at Facebook
Yes.
and trying to do that, which is also very demanding.
In
Menlo Park.
In Menlo Park, okay.
Yep. In September, we signed the deal on September 15th, and
2014?
2015. 2015. I walked into Facebook. I let them know that I had to leave, and they were upset. And I had said, I would stay, but someone's buying my company, and I got to go. And they were.
And they
like,
said, "Wait a minute, we're a customer of RiskIQ. What do you mean? What's going on?"
I guess
I
think they were. Yeah, they would have been a customer.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they knew RiskIQ, and they were pretty jazzed for us to kind of to head over there and know that, like, even though I wasn't working directly for the business, that they could continue working with me in that capacity.
Yes. So you were plugging into a group of people that are very similar to sort of your story. I said you're kind of the scrappy, make things happen kind of person. That's kind of the group that started RiskIQ, and it's kind of what RiskIQ desires to attract, people who want to make things happen and know that if they put their mind to it, they can make things happen.
Yeah.
And, I wanted to drop a footnote to something you said, which is when you start as someone that has done computer programming and you see that you can take an idea and you can manifest it in a body of code that has its own elegance if you're reading it, but then can do work. That model is now happening in the law profession, where lawyers are starting to say, we have to become more efficient. So we have to program things, whether it's in Java or in all sorts of scripting tools that are out there, to automate some of the repetitive tasks that lawyers do.
Right.
So you see the new breed of lawyers that are coming in are much more sophisticated about doing things that years ago we would say, wow, this is like a form of programming. And the law schools are starting to adopt this view that lawyers need to become Python savvy.
That's
which
crazy.
would be unheard of years ago.
I mean, even right now, it makes sense, but it's surprising to hear that.
It's happening. It's happening more and more, this idea that lawyers have to be more than just knowledge workers and subject matter experts. They have to have the ability to take that knowledge and replicate it in some type of container.
Yeah.
So as we create this podcast, we're going to go over some things that almost sound like bits of frequently asked questions that then become like, if you look back to your days of entrepreneurship, what would you say was that magic moment when you said, wow, there's like a business here that can really support me and I don't need to work for another company? I mean, like at some point that happened for you, right?
I mean, for me at the time, coming out, like leaving Baltimore forced me to work. At one point in time, I was working a full-time job. I was at community college, and I was doing like volunteer work in the computer space.
Yes.
In order to get thoroughly introduced into it. And I was overloading my schedule. And so I just learned to work a lot.
Yes.
And that was one of those things that just got instilled within me. And so I never thought about leaving Facebook because I felt very secure in how my time, I was just ruthless with my time management.
Yes.
That I didn't feel the need to introduce that risk into my life of not taking a salary. I felt that I could maintain both positions quite well. And eventually there is a point where you do leave, but I was fortunate to have a business partner who handled the sales component and who handled some of the business side, which is much harder to juggle when you have a full-time position because you can't just take calls randomly. And so fortunately I had someone that could do that who was also just as passionate about the idea. Otherwise I would have had to quit. I think far too often people feel the need that they need to completely quit their position in order to start something. And it's a misnomer.
Yes. You have to have the right employer.
Yeah,
right?
that's
you have
true.
To have an employer that kind of understands that, hey, you do stuff on weekends and evenings and stuff like that. But when you plugged PassiveTotal into RiskIQ, how did you see that sort of transition happening? Because you're a successful acquisition story. Like basically you, your partner, your customer base, your technology have all been folded in to a larger company, and it's worked out. a lot of those deals don't work out.
Yeah.
I mean, comment about that.
I think part of that was the same drive and determination I had in building the company with Steve
Yes.
carried over by, like, to already what you hinted at, the
Yes.
fact that Lou and the founding members of RiskIQ were just as scrappy.
Yes.
And so when we came in, there wasn't some pigeonholing that took place that said, well, we bought your company and it's our tech and we're going to do whatever we need to do to get it done.
Right.
It was very much, okay, guys, you're now part of RiskIQ. Continue to grow that business.
Yes.
And by the way, let's get it integrated into these other solutions we had.
Yes.
I mean, we had a number of suitors that I think could have purchased our company, and the grand plan was always to exit. I was in it for the quick flip. To me, like, I'd rather hit a bunch of home runs than I would try to, win a World Series.
Yes.
And so we took that same drive in building the business and just extended it into RiskIQ.
Nice.
And when we had the acquisition, even though it could have been a number of other people we could have held out,
Yes.
we looked at RiskIQ's story and we looked at the product suite and the portfolio and the opportunity that they created.
Yes.
And we said, this is the perfect match.
Yes.
They had a bunch of data. They had spent years collecting it. At the time, it was the basis of the business. It was
Yes.
how a lot of their products came to be.
Yes.
And they were so complementary, it was a no-brainer.
Yes.
And so when we came in and got acquired to the business, I couldn't wait. Like, the first week, I was writing code to integrate their stuff so that we could take out our competition.
Nice.
And for us, we had thousands of people registered in the system from all over the world and every different industry you could think of. And,
Yes.
To this day, one of the funniest ones to us was like a senior living care center, was a registered user, and Steve and I called him up, and it turns out they were a publicly traded company, and it was a retired intelligence officer who was running their security program,
Really?
and they had real threats.
Really?
Yeah, and so to me,
You wouldn't think that would be true for senior
It would-
living centers, right?
crazy.
Right.
But publicly traded
Yes.
business, and they had real threats.
Yes.
And to me, the most exciting part was being able to use RiskIQ's platform in terms of just where they existed in the market
Yes.
and the capital that they had received,
Yes.
and the leadership from the board and
Yes.
everybody else
Right.
of having done this before. We could supercharge it.
Right.
And so it was like, let's go get tens of thousands of users.
Right.
And let's really grow this thing. And that, at the time, we, when we sold the company, we were under $100,000 in revenue.
Yes.
And the only reason I like to point that out is, it's the system now is in millions of dollars.
Right.
I mean, we're hand over fist, at different, in terms of the amount
Scale.
of customer we're servicing,
Right.
and the scale in which we're delivering this
Yes.
product. And that was exciting. So that's what drove us once I got into the company. Integrate it, and then eventually tap to run product.
So tell us a little more about how does a company decide to even start up with the free edition of PassiveTotal? Like, how does that, what's the mindset that gets somebody there? What are they thinking? Why are they choosing to spend time even with the free version? Because there is a free version still,
That's right.
right?
Yeah, freemium has always been important to me,
Yes.
especially just because I think even in the early days when privacy wasn't as valued as it
Yes.
is now,
Yes.
I felt that in order for me to give my information to someone, I should be getting something in return, that there's a bit of quid pro quo.
Yes.
And so the beauty of a freemium model is that in exchange for giving my information to someone, I am now getting a service or some service. So what brought people to us originally was word of mouth. It was
Right.
the analyst community. It was people that know Steve and myself.
Yes.
And then that was friends of friends. And
Yes.
we did a number of blogs because we were still actively functioning as analysts.
Yes.
We were still looking at the espionage world. We were
Yes.
looking at cyber threats, and we were using the tool we built to investigate them.
Mm-hmm.
And so that became fodder for people to learn how to do investigations themselves. So today, it's really similar how people come to RiskIQ and that freemium product. Oftentimes, it's word of mouth.
Okay.
It's surprising how much people associate PassiveTotal or how that brand equity has a lot of good positive
Yes. Yes.
equity built
Yeah.
into it, right?
Brand value.
Yeah.
Real
And,
brand value.
So I think at this point, it's a lot of word of mouth, and it's also just by virtue of the amount of data that we have. And so just because something's free doesn't mean that it has to be bad.
Yes.
In fact, like that's why bother at that point? And
Yes.
so to me, what's always been very important is that whatever we provide for free
Yes.
should service that person even if they can't pay us.
Yes.
And so if you log into the platform today, obviously we encourage you to sign up with a corporate email address.
Yes.
Because we think that that's fair.
Yes.
But once
So
you're
you can't sign up with a Gmail address.
technically you can sign up with a Gmail address. In the near future, that may not net you
Okay.
as much functionality, but
Okay.
we'll still continue to service that for people
Okay.
who are privacy conscious or they don't want to necessarily give up their information without seeing the final product first.
Okay.
But the general philosophy today is that you can log in and conduct searches and an investigation inside the system using decades worth of internet data.
Yes.
And there is the only limitation that we apply today is just the fact that you're limited in queries.
Okay.
And so that's the way that we've always done it.
So how hard is it for someone that has just basic knowledge of computing and wants to find out, hey, am I the subject of a threat? Is there some training that someone would have to do? Is there some basic knowledge? Like tell us who the typical person downloading is and what they're doing with the free
Sure.
version.
In terms of knowledge, it is a bit more specialized.
Yes.
We find, it's the users tend to be analysts,
Mhm.
people as part of a security operations center, people
Okay.
part of threat hunting efforts.
Yes. Okay.
Doing incident response.
Mhm.
Actively working within a breach.
Right.
And so it certainly tends to fall on the more technical side.
Okay.
And the knowledge that they have to bring is sort of an analytical nature.
Okay.
So they have to be inquisitive. They have to essentially form hypothesis.
Okay.
They need to be able to kind of understand at least the data that they're looking at.
Okay.
So whether it's a domain, an IP address,
Yes.
an email address, what have you.
Yes.
There is a barrier to entry, but we've recognized that early on, and part of the materials that we do in sharing out blogs and white papers, and more importantly, traveling the world delivering threat hunting workshops.
Yes.
All those things allow people to get educated on how to use our system.
Right.
And even if they don't want to use our system, they're getting educated about the data sets and really how to become an analyst.
Do you think there's someone within the Trump organization that's using these tools? I mean, I got to believe that
I have no doubt that there is.
he's got to be the subject of a big blip that's happening right now on all of his various quote unquote physical as well as intangible properties throughout
yeah.
the world, right?
Yeah.
Because he's almost started World War III here, or been involved in the successful prevention of World War III.
Sure.
If we want to be like neutral to both the red and the blue states.
Right.
But conceptually, I would imagine that there must be in that organization some security officer
Absolutely.
who's saying, hey, we got to pay attention to whether or not our properties, because I would be worried about being a guest in a Trump organization hotel, because there's a risk that that hotel may get hacked and then all of my data gets lost as part of that hack.
Yeah, talk about attack surface.
Right.
Like in terms of that's got to be one of an unwieldy one to manage. Just
Because he's got like 500 LLCs and who knows how many brands and who knows how many
Right.
domains and who knows how many trademarks. Apparently he's registering trademarks all over the world as well.
I couldn't imagine the complexity in running that, and I have to imagine that, frankly, that not all of it's being managed.
So, Donald, if you're listening, you
Yeah.
may want to have your chief security officer call RiskIQ.
Yeah.
But I mean, conceptually, that person would be sort of having a team of people,
Correct.
subscribing to these tools, purchasing from RiskIQ various other tools, which we'll talk about
Absolutely.
in another session. But conceptually, the easiest thing to understand would be something like PassiveTotal. That's the easiest way in, isn't it, to start understanding what's out there?
I think so from an analyst perspective, absolutely. That you can simply query your domain name or the IP address of where your stuff's hosted,
Yes.
or even an email address,
Yes.
and immediately identify anyone who's registered a website using that email address or that telephone number.
Yes.
Or any other domain that's also sharing that same IP address.
Yes.
It's literally one search. And so that's the power of that system.
And then when you get back data that's suspicious, what's the next step?
I think that really depends on the context in which you're working.
Yes.
So if I'm an analyst and I get back that data, I need to validate whether or not it is suspicious or malicious.
Right.
I take some level of further research.
Right.
if I'm doing an incident response engagement and I already know that the business has been compromised and what I'm looking at is malicious, then therefore anything that's connected to it's likely malicious as well or suspicious.
Yes.
So I might want to feed that back into my investigative efforts.
Yes.
If I'm doing threat hunting, I might want to go and look to see what Iran is doing on the internet.
Yes.
And talking about this World War III potential.
Right.
Or look for other blogs, not even just by RiskIQ, but other security vendors who are reporting on various threat actors.
Mm-hmm.
I can take indicators that they're sharing or pieces of infrastructure, search for that in PassiveTotal, and then build out my own open source investigation.
Yes.
And have with some reasonable certainty, take that information and put it into my defenses.
Right.
There's enough information out there today that's used as marketing materials.
Yes.
That is surprisingly comprehensive and good.
Yes.
A great starting point for a business.
Yes.
I won't go as far as to say businesses don't need a threat intelligence program.
Yes.
But if you're operating on an extreme budget and maybe you can't afford to have dedicated staff or a large team, or you can't afford to pay for services from these threat intelligence companies or these security businesses,
right.
At the very least, one competent person who knows what they're doing can take open source information, leverage a tool like RiskIQ's PassiveTotal, even on the freemium side, in order to build out an investigation and feed that information back into their business.
I mean, even nonprofits have to worry, right? Even like CARE or Red Cross or any of these nonprofits that have brands have to worry that someone is compromising them, right?
Oh, yeah. Because
there's a lot of brand counterfeiting, right?
There's brand issues. I mean, there's I think we mentioned this before. If you're operating on the internet, business or otherwise, even as an individual, you are exposing yourself to some level of risk.
Yes.
That risk, there's a tolerance that exists within all of us. Some people are willing to put out photos and share them out with random people and include the latitude and longitude of when they were taking and where they were taken.
Yes.
And that is something they feel comfortable with.
Yes.
Other people, go and limit that digital footprint or that attack surface as much as possible by not sharing, by in fact not being on those services, not engaging with those services. And so I think it's a matter of everyone has some level of risk operating on the internet, and it's a matter of what their tolerance is.
What some people don't realize, and you only get to know this stuff if you've spent enough time dealing with all the ugly cases, but there are bad organizations. I'm not going to say they're located in any particular country because they're actually in a number of countries, including in the U.S., that are creating the equivalent of dossiers on each of us by scraping information from so many different sources to create a valuable collection that they themselves sell as collections of data that will allow the impersonation of a Jack Russo or a Brandon Dixon. That's just the fact of life here.
I call it exhaust.
Yeah.
It might be called fourth-party collection or...
the data exhaust. Yeah. Every time you have a LinkedIn, yet you want to have a LinkedIn because you'd like people to know what you do. Every time you have a Facebook, every time you post a photograph, it creates an addition to that dossier that enhances the value of that aggregation when it's pulled in with data that's been stolen, like credit card information and the like. I mean, I'll just tell the story and then we'll wrap up on this section. I get a call from a bank in Mesquite, Texas, saying, when are you going to pay your $50,000 line of credit that you took 6 months ago?
Never a good call.
Never a good call. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And they say, well, you took a $50,000 line of credit and claimed that you would pay within 6 months, and we're like month number 7 and you haven't paid. And I'm like, I don't know your bank. I don't know who you. It was a legitimate bank. Mm-hmm. It was a line of credit, but the money never went to me. It went to someone that essentially stole my identity. I had to do a bunch of work to recover my identity. They actually found the person that did it and prosecuted them and convicted them. Nice. But it was like $50,000 was obtained because there was enough information gathered about me, combined with presumably my social security number that had been stolen or taken in some fashion, along with a bunch of phone numbers that were fabricated phone numbers, but that created a way for them to somehow verify something with somebody in Texas, as though I had moved to Texas, which I hadn't. And the net result was a line of credit granted by a bank, which had not been paid because it was stolen by a criminal.
And see, what you're raising here is the individual.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Imagine a business where, I think, at least in the States, people often think about businesses as people, or they're treated that way. But the reality is that a business it doesn't necessarily have a single face. It's a collection of individuals and products and services. And so that's really where I think you hit at the heart of one of the issues that RiskIQ solves, and that's the challenge in being on the internet as a business.
Yes.
As an individual, I can choose to withhold certain things. I could basically have no digital footprint whatsoever. But as a business, in order to operate and be successful, if I'm not online, do I even exist?
Got to be online.
You almost have to be online.
Yes.
So it goes back to that level of risk tolerance.
Yes.
And a business innately, by delivering services, especially when they're digital, are just going to have more infrastructure to support that, and thus a larger attack surface.
Yes.
And the biggest issue is the fact that people come and go from businesses.
Yes.
And as they come and go, institutional knowledge leaves with them about assets that exist online, or former marketing projects, or events that are held in other states or countries.
Yes.
And they don't necessarily go down. And so this business presence doesn't have an individual you can go to and say, hey, Jack, you need to take these things down because it's expired. It hasn't been patched. It hasn't been secured.
Right.
And that's where our services come in, is that we're able to help businesses stay on top of that.
Yes.
We provide them the tools to get that visibility. We give them an inventory of those assets and what they look like online. And then we do the hard work of continuously monitoring it. And the benefit that we bring is that they don't have to worry about that. It's kind of like an insurance policy. And the benefit is that rather than having to spend their time collecting what they look like online, which is it feels almost impossible, especially as you get into these Fortune 100, Fortune 500 businesses.
Mega companies.
Yeah. All of a sudden, they can spend their time recognizing where the vulnerabilities are and prioritizing their efforts so that they can get the biggest bang from their buck with the team that they have, which is liable to be small.
So you are the resident expert on PassiveTotal.
Yeah, and I'd like to think that resident expert on the rest of the products as well by running product for the organization for 2 years. But
so tell people who are listening to this podcast and want more information how they can reach you. Obviously, they can go to riskiq.com. There's more podcasts on riskiqradio.com. But how would they reach you?
Well, they can reach me at brandon.dixon@riskiq.com. And then we've talked about PassiveTotal here.
Yes.
You can go to community.riskiq.com and register for a free account, and you'll have to validate your email address, and you can start running free queries and seeing the data that RiskIQ
And there's
has.
enough blogs and other educational material even for people that just want to learn more and become themselves the beginning of an analyst.
Correct. And if you're really interested, we have events that are constantly happening throughout the local U.S. and occasionally outside the country as well that they're the threat hunting workshops, abbreviated as THW.
Okay.
And those are free to sign up, free for attendance. Space is obviously limited depending on where we go. But if you're a new analyst, that is definitely a place to check out. Going to those events. And if you can't attend them, much like we're doing this podcast right now,
yes,
we've actually went and I've personally recorded with some of our product marketing team on YouTube.
Nice.
You could type in Threat Hunting Workshop. We're likely to be one of the first ones that come up, but you can see my lovely face and hear my voice for several hours as we walk through.
That's why you're so good in the podcast.
Yeah, doing threat hunting and educating people.
Great.
I'm a huge proponent of that.
Great. Thanks, Brandon. Thanks for coming. My name is Jack Russo. We've been presenting the RiskIQ Radio, and we'll continue to do it and unfold more information about how people can get to know the company and its products. I'm the managing partner at Computer Law Group, Jay Russo or Jack at computerlaw.com. 650-327-9800 if you're using the phone. I mean, it's so old-fashioned, right?
Consider looking it up in PassiveTotal as well.
I mean, I looked at the company's website here, and I don't see a phone number. Maybe we need to put like an 800 number
I think
down.
I think we have
it's
an
here
800.
somewhere.
It's somewhere buried
on the first
in this.
page,
Yeah.
right? Of course, no one in this industry uses the phone anymore. It's like, hey, that's so backwards.
It's a robo-dialer.
Exactly, right. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to RiskIQ Radio.